Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Alison Hoons and I'm a knowledge broker and a member of Arthritis Research Canada's Volunteer Arthritis Patient Advisory Board. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that, especially on this long weekend, recognizing the importance of action on truth and reconciliation, that Arthritis Research Canada's headquarters are located on the unceded, traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. We express our deep gratitude to the keepers of the land. I'm thrilled to be your moderator for today's webinar, and I'm excited to learn from our biosimilars expert, Dr. Diane Lacaille, and from Nikki Batty, who is our patient expert for this session. This webinar is part of episode 11 of Arthritis Research Education Series, Biosimilars Unpacked, which focuses on biosimilars, biosimilar transition policies in Canada, and the impact on people living with arthritis. If you're joining us for the first time, the Arthritis Research Education Series was created by our Patient Advisory Board. The purpose is to share examples of research that can impact the lives of those with arthritis. We invite you to stay on at the end of the webinar to watch the video for this episode. If you're unable to do so, don't worry, because it's also available on our website. And after Dr. Lacaille's presentation, there will be a question and answer session with both Dr. Lacaille and with Nikki Batty. So please click on the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. It's in the lower right-hand side of your screen to type in your questions. You'll note that there won't be an ability to use chat in this webinar, so all of your questions should go into the Q&A section. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, and we'll do our best to ensure that we answer the questions that most people are interested in. So there's an upvoting feature that you can say, oh yeah, I'm also interested in that question, and then we'll know that there's several people that would like that question addressed. Understandably, we won't be able to answer questions that could be interpreted as giving medical advice for any specific individual. So please do, though, speak to your healthcare provider if you have any questions that are specific to your situation. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Diane Lacaille, who's a professor of medicine and the Mary Pack Chair at the University of British Columbia, as well as the Scientific Director of Arthritis Research Canada, Arthritis Research Canada. She has pioneered research using administrative health data from the BC Ministry of Health to optimize treatment and improve health and quality of care for patients living with arthritis. She brings extensive knowledge and expertise to today's topic of unpacking biosimilars, both as a rheumatologist whose patients were included in the implementation of BC's biosimilar initiative, and as a scientist conducting research in the area of biosimilars. So over to Dr. Lacaille.
Here we are. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be speaking to you today, and I will try to unpack for you this complex topic of biosimilars. Hold on, sorry about this. There we go. So first, a little bit about biosimilars. And before we talk about biosimilars, we have to first talk about biologics. So what is a biologic medication? So they are medications that are made by living cells, like an antibody that's produced by a cell, or a hormone like insulin, for example. And they have very targeted effects on cell function in terms of either blocking a receptor or turning on or turning off a cell process. And because they are made by cells and they're complex protein, they're larger and more complex molecules than drugs that are produced and made by a chemical reaction. And you can see here the difference between aspirin, insulin, and a monoclonal antibody that is a biologic that's commonly used in arthritis. Because they're proteins, they can't be taken by mouth, otherwise they'd get digested in your stomach. So they have to be taken by injections or intravenous infusions. And again, because they're made by cells, the process for making them is very complex and uses state-of-the-art technology. And because cells are living organisms, they're less consistent from one batch to the next batch than when a medication is made by a chemical reaction where time after time the chemical reaction is identical. They're used quite widely to treat a variety of diseases like diabetes, arthritis, cancer, inflammatory bowel disease. So arthritis isn't the only field where we use them. What about a biosimilar? So these medications come on the market when patents expire for the originator biologic drug that was originally discovered and brought to market by the company that discovered the medication. And they come to market when the patent expires, which means that after a certain amount of protected time, then other companies are allowed to make the same medication. So a biosimilar is a very close copy to the original biologic medication that was discovered and made by the original company. And I like to compare this to an identical twin. An identical twin is very similar, but is not exactly identical. So this is very similar to that. So they will have the same amino acid sequence, and those are the building blocks of proteins, but they may not be exactly identical. They might be slight differences in the structure, in the way the proteins fold, for example. And the price is roughly half that of the originator. And the reason for the lower cost is that the biosimilar companies don't have to invest in all of the research that's needed to discover and develop a new medication. They come on the market once all of this work has been done, so the cost only reflects the cost of actually making the drug. Now, this begs the question, how similar is a biosimilar? So as I mentioned, they're not identical to their originator because of the natural variability in the process to make them, which is different from what we call a generic drug, when a chemically produced drug after a patent expires where the product is identical. But the difference between a biosimilar and the originator biologic is very comparable to the variability from one batch to the next batch of the originator biologic. And I want to emphasize that very strict controls are always in place during the manufacturing process, whether it's an originator biologic or biosimilar biologic, to make sure that this little bit of variability from batch to batch does not affect the way the medicine works, so that it is as effective and as safe. And the same manufacturing and regulatory controls are in place for producing originator biologic and biosimilar biologic. So biosimilars are approved by Health Canada once a company has to prove to Health Canada that their product is highly similar to the originator biologic at the molecular and cellular level. So that means the structure of the molecule, what it does, how it moves into, through, and out of the cell in the body, and that there's no clinically meaningful differences in terms of its effectiveness, so how it affects the disease, its safety, so side effects, and its immunogenicity, so the ability to cause an immune response compared to the originator biologic. And the approval relies on the results of the clinical trials that were done by the company that produced the originator biologic. So it means that the biosimilar will be approved for treating the same diseases as the original biologic that was made by the original company. As I've mentioned before, the manufacturing process is held to the same rigorous quality standards, and safety continues to be monitored after Health Canada approval. So biosimilars, although they're less expensive, they are of the same quality and they deliver the same benefits as the originator biologic agents. How widely have they been used? Well, they've been used in Europe for longer than in Canada. There's now 17 years of experience. So this is not a new kid on the block. We've been using these for a long time. There's 93 biosimilars approved for a variety of different diseases since 2006. And in 2017, the European Medicine Agency provided a report on their 10 years of monitoring, and their report stated that they did not identify any relevant differences in the nature, the severity, or the frequency of adverse effects between the biosimilar and their reference or the originator biologic. In Canada, we have had 51 biosimilars approved since 2009, and specifically in rheumatology, we have 14 approved biosimilar since 2014. Around the world, they're also used widely, and the ICMRA, which is an international coalition of regulatory authorities from countries across the world, including the WHO as an observer, released in 2019 a statement of confidence about biosimilars, stating that they are biologic medicines of proven quality, approved after rigorous scientific evaluation by their regulatory authorities, and that they have been used safely for years. These are the biosimilars that are used in inflammatory arthritis in Canada. Currently, the biologics for which biosimilars are currently approved include adalimumab, etanercept, infliximab, and rituximab. As you can see, adalimumab is the one that has the largest number of biosimilars, and you can see the diseases for which they're indicated. Now, why would we recommend to be using biosimilars? What is the benefit of transitioning to biosimilars? So biosimilar health policies are policies that are designed to encourage patients and doctors to use biosimilars in order to save healthcare resources. And they require that, when available, a biosimilar be used in order for the cost of the medication to be covered by our provincial drug plans. And there's policies that apply to either new prescriptions, so when somebody starts a new biologic medication, or a transition policy for when patients are currently using an originator biologic and they need to switch to a biosimilar for the same medication once it's available. These policies have, as I mentioned, existed in most European countries and are supported by Health Canada. I want to mention that especially for the biosimilar transition, that the prescription change is made by the doctor. This isn't a change that's made by pharmacists. And once people are transitioned to a biosimilar, they will continue to get the same biosimilar, even if there's multiple ones available for the same originator biologic. So it's not like people get switched from one drug company to another every time they go to renew their medications. Here you can see the biosimilar transition policies in the various provinces and when they were implemented. And British Columbia was the first province to adopt a biosimilar transition policy in 2019. So we now have 4 years of experience with this biosimilar transition. And you can see when these have been adopted in other provinces. Now, the purpose of the biosimilar, or the benefits, I should say, of a biosimilar transition is that it provides an opportunity for cost saving. And this is important if we want to have a sustainable healthcare system. The total savings of the 4 high-selling biologics targeted by the Biosimilar Initiative in British Columbia saved an estimated $990 million between 2020 and 2022. And if the national uptake for these biosimilars had followed the trend in BC, there would have been an additional saving of $1.8 billion over that same time period. So we're not talking about marginal or small amounts of saving. We're talking about a lot of money that can get reinvested into the healthcare. And this is really important to people living with arthritis because there are many new biologic agents in the pipeline. This is a very exciting time for rheumatology. We have a lot of biologic agents, but there's even more that are in various levels of discovery and of testing. And we anticipate that there will be a lot more of these agents that are going to come on the market. So if we want the healthcare system to be able to afford the new innovative medications, we have to be able to spend less on the older medications when a less expensive alternative is available. And this will allow the provincial drug plans to reinvest saving so that patients can access drugs that are not currently covered or drugs that become available in the future. In some provinces, these policies have also allowed easier access to biologics by requiring that patients try fewer other non-biologic medications before gaining access to a biologic, and this was the case in New Brunswick. The government can also reinvest the savings into other services, and there are examples of that in BC of the government reinvesting in funding for nursing in specialized clinics, in other provinces funding for counseling or physiotherapy, occupational therapy, other services that can benefit patients with arthritis. At the level of each patient, another benefit that people are not always aware of is that some private insurances have a lifetime limit. And once people reach their lifetime limit, their insurance company will not cover their medications anymore. So if the insurance company pays less for the biologic, then it reduces the likelihood that a patient may reach their lifetime limit. And it may, as I mentioned before, also reduce the number of other medications that people have to try. That's obviously of benefit to patients. Now, transition policies come with some concerns for patients, and we want to make sure that we acknowledge that and talk a little bit about that. Some of the concerns that I've heard from patients are, why are these policies needed? Change is stressful. People are hesitant to start a new medication because anything new carries some level of uncertainty and some level of perceived risk, especially for patients who have had many years of disease that was not controlled. Their disease is finally well controlled, and now we're asking them to change, and there's a fear of losing that disease control. So, I acknowledge all these concerns, but I can say that, in the thousands of patients that have been transitioned in British Columbia, that people, although they may have been hesitant at first because of these changes that are stressful for them, the transition has gone very well. And there are, I'm hoping that I'm going to address some of those concerns with today's presentation. Also, one thing that does happen with transitioning to a drug that's made by a different company is that the patient support program changes, and people have built a relationship with their patient support program. And unfortunately, this is something that does need to be changed. But the rheumatology community has worked very closely with the pharmaceutical companies that make the biosimilar medications. And we emphasize to them the importance of having a very reliable, a very responsive patient support program, and how important this is for us and for our patients if they want us to use their medications. There's concern about whether the biosimilars have been tested enough, and I'm hoping that today's presentation is going to alleviate that concern. And, will their immune system react differently to a new drug? That's a potential risk, but I can say from experience that it's a very, very tiny risk, but people could get an injection site reaction to a biosimilar when they didn't have one for an originator. And at least in British Columbia, if people do not have the same response and have tried two biosimilar for a given originator, they have the option of switching back to the originator biologic, which I think is a huge reassurance for both clinicians and patients that we are trying this, but if it doesn't work out, there's the option to go back. And there's also concern about the hassles with the insurance for reimbursement, because now if you're changing to a new drug, often these papers need to be filled out again, but that's where the patient support programs are also very helpful. So I'm now going to move on to our research. And these are the questions that I'm going to answer, but I'm going to go through these in turn. So the first question is, why are we doing this research? So I've already told you that to be approved by regulatory agencies such as Health Canada, companies have to conduct highly controlled studies, which are called randomized controlled trial, and show that the biosimilars work similarly in the body, that there's as effective for the disease and as safe as the already approved originator biologic. So why do we need more research? Well, because we also want to show that once these drugs are available on the market, we want to look at real-world evidence to monitor how they are used by doctors, and that when they are used in less controlled conditions, in everybody, not highly selected patients that are enrolled in trials, that they remain as effective and as safe as the originator medications. So in British Columbia, the health policies for biosimilar use were implemented in 2017 for people starting new anti-TNF medication, and in May of 2019 for the transition to a biosimilar. And at that time, there were only biosimilars available for etanercept and infliximab. The biosimilar for adalimumab didn't become available until 2021. So this policy provided us an ideal context to study how can we observe the safety and the effectiveness of biosimilars compared to originators using data for the entire province of British Columbia. And what we looked at was that we compared how long people with arthritis continued taking either etanercept or infliximab biosimilar in people who started a new biologic or in people who transitioned from an originator to a biosimilar, compared to people who used an originator for the same biologic before the policy change. And the reason we look at how long people stay on treatment is because it usually reflects how long the drug is working and that people have no major side effects. Because if those happen, then we would stop the medication. So who was in the study? So this tells you how many people on the originator or biosimilar of each of these medications that we looked at. And about half of, or a little bit more than half, were people who had rheumatoid arthritis, but we also included people with ankylosing spondylitis and people with psoriatic arthritis. And you can see here the average age was in the 50s, and as expected with this disease, between about two-thirds were women. And these are our results, and you can see that for people who are starting a new biologic, if we follow 100 people to the left here, if we follow 100 people for a year, we see that between 30 and 40 people would stop the medication, and that the number is similar between people who started, I'm looking for my cursor, the originator and people who started the biosimilar. The small difference observed with biologic is not statistically significant, which means that it could occur by chance. And to the right here, you can see what we call the treatment survival, which represents the proportion of people that remain on treatment over time. So at time 0, you can see that everybody is on the treatment since they just started the medication. And then over time, where's my cursor? Over time, this gradually decreases I'm going to take etanercept. So that by about 2 years, which is what the time that most people were followed in the study, about half of them still remain on treatment. And there were no significant differences between biosimilar and originator. The small difference that we observed with infliximab was not statistically significant, which means that it can occur by chance. And this adalimumab here is just comparing to the use of adalimumab over the same period when there was no biosimilar that existed, just to kind of tell us what happens over that period of time in terms of treatment change. Now, for people who transitioned to a biosimilar, here you can see the number of people, and here the numbers are identical because we actually matched people, so found somebody that was similar in order to compare. And again, about 2/3 are in people with rheumatoid arthritis, a little bit less in infliximab. And for people who transition, from the time of transition over, if we take 100 people over 1 year, we see that approximately 15 people with etanercept, having a really hard time with my cursor, sorry, about 15 people with etanercept and about 10 people with infliximab would stop the medication. And there was no difference between the originator and the biosimilar. And these same treatment survival curves are identical for etanercept. And for infliximab, the small difference of better survival on treatment for the biosimilar compared to the originator was not statistically significant and was likely due to chance. So what we found in summary, we also found no difference in risk of infections, whether we're looking at severe infections requiring hospitalization or mild infections that are treated with antibiotics without requiring hospitalization. We found no difference in use of other medications that would indicate that the drug wasn't as effective, so people had to increase their other arthritis meds, and no difference in the use of other healthcare services like hospitalizations, visits to the emergency room, or physician visits that might indicate some unintended consequences between people who used the biosimilar or people who used the originator. So what do these findings mean for people living with arthritis? So our study provides real-world evidence showing that when people use a biosimilar, infliximab or etanercept for inflammatory arthritis, they remain on treatment for as long as if they'd used an originator. It's true for people starting a new medication or people transitioning, and there's no difference in infections or healthcare service, as I just mentioned. And these findings suggest that biosimilars are as safe and as effective. So the takeaway findings: to be approved by Health Canada, biosimilars must have an identical amino acid sequence, the building blocks of the protein as originator. They have to be very similar in structure and function, demonstrate the same efficacy and safety. They have the same quality, the same high standards of production and controls, and deliver the same benefits. But they cost less because of the savings on all the new drug development cost. And it's an opportunity for major cost savings that can be reinvested to improve access to either existing or new innovative medications. And the real-world evidence, both in Europe and in Canada, shows that there are no safety concerns or no concerns of lower effectiveness.
Thank you, Dr. Lacaille. I learned a tremendous amount through that. I heard same quality, same safety, same effectiveness, and less expensive. And I also wasn't aware that on a personal basis that would, if there's a limit, a lifetime limit on insurance, that there's more space within that limit than for an individual taking biologics. So thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot of people are not aware of that.
No, I had not thought of that one before. I understood the importance of the benefit for the system in that, and particularly that we would get access to more drugs that were in the pipeline. But I didn't think about the personal benefit in relation to the lifetime limit. So thank you. Nikki, before we move on to some of the questions, actually, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce Nikki Batty properly. Nikki is a member of Arthritis Research Canada's Arthritis Patient Advisory Board, and she lives with rheumatoid arthritis, and she's joining us for the Q&A session today. And before we move into the questions, Nikki, did you have any comments about what you heard today?
Yeah, thank you, Diane, for doing such a well presentation, really explaining everything thoroughly. That was really well done. And for a patient as myself, of course, the uncertainty of being switched over from something that's working great for me for so long into something that I'm unfamiliar with, you've definitely provided some confidence and clarity. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Nikki. So I noticed that there are some questions already in the question and answer section. Before we move to those, if there are other participants on this call who also have questions, just click on the Q&A, which is directly below the pictures on your screen. And you can, first of all, add any questions if you wish. But also, if there's a question that you particularly like, feel free to click on that thumbs up. That lets me know that there are other people who would also like that question addressed. So the first question that I'm seeing there is, so are the biologics and the biosimilars, are they made from cells? And if so, where do those cells come from? Dr. Lacaille, that might be a good question for you.
So yes, they are made from cells, and this is part of the complex, what I call the manufacturing process. And there are cell lines that are produced specifically for that purpose, and that are, you know, modified, like engineered to do exactly what we want them to do and to produce those antibodies. Where they come from, these are like commercially available cell lines that are highly regulated by Health Canada to make sure that there's nothing that those cells are going to do that are going to be of concern to people. And we don't take the whole cell, we just, for example, with if we're taking adalimumab, for example, we only take the antibody that's created by that cell. So the cell doesn't do anything that's going to interact with your cells, just to kind of maybe reassure a concern.
Thank you. The second question is about what choice there is for patients in this process. So first of all, from Dr. Lacaille's perspective, and then Nikki, feel free to add in if you've had those conversations with your rheumatologist or healthcare provider in making choices. So first, Dr. Lacaille.
Yeah, so I think the choice is that the policies apply to the cost of the medication being covered by the drug provincial plan. And I have to say that so you're not obliged in that, you know, you can stay on your medication, but then you'd have to pay for it yourself, which is obviously not necessarily a viable alternative because these are very expensive medications. Some private insurance plan may continue, but most private insurance plan, once a biosimilar transition policy is in place in a province, they want to have the same cost saving as the government does. So they generally will also follow and not cover. But you may have a choice if you happen to have an insurance policy that allows you to remain on the originator. But I must, you know, from practical experience, usually the insurance plans will follow suit because they also want to have the same savings so that they can then provide funding. So in theory, yes, there's a choice because when it's not mandated that you switch, but it's mandating that you switch if you want the cost to continue to be covered. So practically, because these drugs are like thousands of dollars, the originators are like in the $20,000 to $30,000 a year. It's very hard to be able to continue taking the medication.
Thank you, Dr. Lacaille. Nikki, from your perspective, have you been in that situation or in a similar situation as far as making choices about medications with your rheumatologist?
Yeah, with my present rheumatologist, I've had multiple different scenarios of trying different biologics. So I definitely trust my healthcare professional. I built that relationship and that dynamic with her. As far as insurance goes, that's something that, we would have to, I've experienced multiple times where it's just a lot of paperwork involved. And so if my rheumatologist, deems that a biosimilar would work as beneficial, I'd definitely go along with it.
Thank you, Nikki. The next question is about the savings for the government. There's actually a couple of questions that are related to this in the chat box. And I apologize to people if as I'm reading these questions, I kind of have to interpret some of the underlying question with the question. So I apologize if I've misinterpreted. But the questions related to the savings is, Dr. Lacaille, can you speak to whether, to your knowledge, how those savings have actually been applied versus theoretically applied in BC? Is there a source of information that tells us that, oh, because of this savings, they did this? Is there any direct link, for example?
So it's difficult to actually track it, and the government in the rheumatology community was very involved with the government in those discussions, and the rheumatology community was very much on board with the biosimilar transition for the reason that I explained, that we recognize that we have a lot of upcoming biologic medication and we want them to get covered for our patients. So we were told that they're not allowed to track it one per one and say, okay, we're doing a transition and this drug will approve that drug. But we have been reassured that the funding, that the funds that are being saved are going to get reinvested in medications. So the experience has been shortly after the biosimilar transition policy, we had a new biologic that was approved in psoriatic arthritis and in ankylosing spondylitis. That was shortly afterwards. But it's not like they can't say this is the government does not sort of tell us we saved X dollars, therefore now we're approving this one. It's a more global conceptual level. So that's in BC. So we have been assured and told that it would. We have seen it with 2 drugs that have been approved since the biosimilar transition. Now, can I tell you for sure they wouldn't have been approved, or does it translate dollar per dollar? It's a bit harder to answer. There's other provinces where, and I'm going to give you another example that's more direct. I know it's not in arthritis, but in inflammatory bowel disease, they did not have funding for nurses in their clinic. And as a result of the adoption of the biosimilar transition, there was a new funding mechanisms for the gastroenterologist to be able to have nurses in their clinic. And this was actually a model that they emulated from rheumatology, because we had advocated for being able to have nurses in our clinics a few years before. And so we have had nurses funding in our clinic for longer than gastroenterology did. But in other provinces, they've emulated that. And I'm just trying to remember which provinces it was where the government approved the funding as a result of the savings. And New Brunswick was an example where they changed the criteria for accessing biologic, such that people had to try a smaller number of non-biologic medications before being able to access them. So there are examples of fairly direct, but overall it is more at a conceptual level.
Thank you. When you
Long answer,
referred
sorry.
to biosimilars and other provincial, what's available in other provinces, there is a question related to that in the chat box in the Q&A right now. And is that, are biosimilars available now in Ontario, to your knowledge?
So biosimilars are available. Biosimilars have been available so that ever since the adalimumab has been available since 2021, and etanercept and infliximab, I think since 2019. So yes, they've been available, but they were not previously mandated to switch. But currently Ontario is going through a biosimilar transition policy, where patients who are on an existing biologic for which there is a biosimilar available, I think people have until the end of December to transition. So they've been available, but they previously were not required, or I hate the word mandated, it just sounds awful, but there was not an obligation and a policy. And, you know, now the policy is being implemented even in Ontario.
Thank you. I see another question that might be appropriate for both Nikki and Dr. Lacaille from your differing perspectives. So there's an individual who's getting their first injection today. The name of the medication I'm not even going to try and pronounce. So let's just stick with a medication, first one today. And understandably, there's some concern about potential side effects. I'm wondering, you know, approximately how they would know, what length of time, and how would they know that this medication is the right one for them. So from a rheumatologist point of view, and then from a patient point of view, Nikki, how do you, when there's a new medication, how do you, what things do you think about in determining, oh, okay, well, this medication is right for this patient or right for me? First of all, to Nikki, and then to Dr. Lacaille.
I think for myself, I definitely have to prepare mentally and physically before taking that medication. So for your first day, good luck to you. Don't worry. I would definitely hydrate and eat very well. And what I mean by that is definitely up your nutrients and water intake. As for my personal experiences in the past, I think the rule of thumb from what my rheumatologist did say is about approximately 3 months to give it that amount of time, 3 to 6, I believe. But Diane Lacaille can further comment on that. However, just notice you're the best person to know your own body. And reaction wise, I personally started to lose a little bit of hair on a different biologic, and I knew, you know, the second, third time around, this isn't normal. So spoke to my physician right away, and my rheumatologist had recommended a different one.
Thank you. Very important firsthand experience there. Over to Dr. Lacaille.
I would, echo what Nikki has mentioned. And then in terms of the duration, it's very variable. So some people will notice an improvement very shortly after starting a new, I'm assuming this is not a transition. I'm assuming this is starting a new, the first time on this biologic medication, correct, Allison?
I do not know that from the question.
Okay. So I'm answering this assuming that we're not talking about a transition, we're talking about starting a new biologic agent. So, you know, sometimes the effect is very rapid and people will notice a benefit within a couple of weeks, but really I would not sort of set that expectation because but those are the stories that you sometimes hear, and then patients are disappointed. I'm not noticing any difference. So I think you'll have to realize that for a lot of the biologics, and it does vary from biologic to biologic. Some are slower to start working than others, but a number of people, will take some time before it fully works. And that's why before saying that a biologic doesn't work, we usually want to see that a patient has been on the biologic for at least 4 months. And some people, you may get some benefit and you start to see some improvement, but you're not quite there yet. But what you're at 3-4 months doesn't mean that that's where it's going to end. Often people continue to improve over time, for up to the first 6 months, and even sometimes longer than that. And part of it depends on how, if you think about it, if this disease has been turned on for a long time and there's a lot of inflammation in the joints, it takes a lot of undoing before even if you stop the process, all this inflammation that is accumulated in the joints, it takes a while for it all to go away. So it's highly variable from patient to patient and medication to medication. You may be lucky and get like a super great benefit immediately, but it's not uncommon that it takes months. But they're generally faster acting than the non-biologic medications, where it traditionally always takes at least a couple of months before it works.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience. Yours as well, Nikki?
Yeah, definitely on my last biologic that I'm currently on, I almost noticed an immediate difference within like 2 to 3 weeks, as Dr. Lacaille mentioned, but now I've been persistently on it for the past 6 months and I know it works well for me.
Excellent. So the next question is about the patient support programs. And Nikki, have you had experience with patient support programs?
Actually, no, I personally have not.
Okay, so the question is, what kind of supports, how would a patient support program help an individual in terms of helping them with their biosimilar? Is there any difference in how they would support with any medication? How would you address that question, Dr. Lacaille?
So a patient support program is, just so that we're clear what we're talking about, is a third-party company that is hired by the company who makes a medication in order to support patients that are taking their biologic agent. And usually so they're not, it's not directly the pharmaceutical company, it's a third-party company that they are partnering with, which I think is an important distinction. The primary purpose is to help the access to the biologic agent. So they will help make sure that, for example, look at does the patient have insurance company, or does the patient have a private insurance? So some people may wonder, well, where does this all come into play between the government funding and the insurance company funding? And those things are slightly different from provinces to provinces. So what I'm talking about, for example, in British Columbia, even if the medication is paid by the government, there's a proportion of it that is paid by the insurance. It's what we call the copay, or your deductible. So until you've reached your deductible, either you personally or your insurance company has to pay a portion of it. And this varies from province to province. Other provinces, like in Ontario, for example, some people, it's entirely the insurance company that covers the cost. And some people, it's covered by the government. And again, a portion of it is covered by either the patient or the insurance company. So this is complicated to navigate. And the patient support program helps with that process, finding out who's covering what, making sure all the paperwork is filled out. So from a physician perspective, it makes my job easier because I'm just sent a form and say, fill this out. And for the patient, it's easier because same thing for them, rather than chasing after the insurance company to find the form, send it to the doctor, get the doctor to fill it out. So all this is coordinated by the patient support program. The other thing that's nice is that when a renewal is needed, so the pharmacare, the coverage by the provincial drug plan is only usually for a year. So when it's up for renewal, it reminds me. So it sends me a reminder about a month before, okay, the renewal for this is going to be due, and sometimes it was already done, but sometimes if the patient appointment didn't fall close to when it's due, it sets a reminder and I make sure that it gets done on time. So and then the other part of this is some companies will provide, based on a patient's own financial situation, they may provide some financial assistance to patients who are not able to afford the copay or the proportion of the drug cost that they would need to pay. So that's on the financial and logistics side. The other thing is that these programs also have a nurse that is available. They usually have a 24/7 hotline where if you have any questions, you can call them, and it can be anything from, oh, I forgot to put my drug in the fridge, is it still good? Or I injected it and half of it squirted it out, what do I do? It can be practical little things like that where you can't necessarily get a hold of your rheumatologist on the spot to tell you what to do. Or it can also be with assisting with things like the vaccinations that need to be done. For example, we screen for tuberculosis before starting a biologic. So a lot of the patient support programs will help with that process of everything that needs to be done before somebody starts their first biologic. So those are, and then some of them offer other types of services, like I'm aware of a company that will provide access to a dietitian. So there's other things like that some education services, they will also provide a video that shows you how to do the injection. They will provide injection training, so you can have a nurse that goes on a video conferencing like this or in person, depending on where you live, and shows you how to do the injections. So the purpose is, as the name implies, to support patients in transitioning to starting a new medication and arranging both sort of the logistic, but also the day-to-day support and being there to be available. And they're useful to both the patients and the physicians. We really like the patient support program. They make our job easier as well.
Nikki, having heard that, what do you think about patient support programs?
So I'm sorry, I have a cold, so I'm not quite here, but yes, going back to the patient support program, I definitely have dealt with one for my biologics, and they have been amazing. As Dr. Lacaille was mentioning, they are the liaison between the patient, the doctor, and the companies to get your funding for your medication. So mine have been phenomenal in just sending me email reminders for everything. I unfortunately recently had COVID, so I emailed them saying, hey, I have COVID. I probably should wait for my medication to be administered. They were amazing with that. And I do a monthly infusion, but prior to, I was doing a self injection, and I was too afraid to do it myself. So I actually had a nurse come in and train my husband so he could administer it on me. So in that way, the support programs are amazing for not just yourself as a patient, but those who live with you too.
Great point. And listening to both of you speak, I suspect that they're underutilized. That they could probably be better utilized for making it, the access, when you mentioned Dr. Lacaille, 24-hour potential, some of them you can ask a question that you might have to wait several days or longer to hear back from other members of your team. Now, I noticed the majority of the questions that remain in the Q&A, they're really kind of, it's possible that answering these questions could be perceived as personal medical advice because they're about specific medications and specific side effects. And as we stated in the introduction, it's not an advisable way to get personal advice on a public webinar. That doesn't mean that these questions aren't important. And in fact, as I read them, they're very important. So I would encourage those individuals to reach out to their own healthcare providers in order to have those questions answered. I'm looking at the time, and we've got 4 minutes remaining. Nikki, is there anything else that you wanted to share from your perspective? You know, I was thinking of that slide that Dr. Lacaille showed of what the patient concerns were about switching to biosimilars. And then having heard the content today, is there anything else that you would like to add to the discussion?
Just from a patient's point of view, anytime a new medication is mentioned or something's not working out for you, it's always the uncertainty of what side effects can occur. By Dr. Lacaille presenting biosimilars, and of course the name, how similar it is to a biologic, it definitely gives a lot of us more clarity that research is being done for folks like us who are living with this day to day, and that we can trust this decision and allow us to make better informed decisions for ourselves.
Thank you. And I see one remaining question, actually, Dr. Lacaille, that there could be time that's just being added to the chat box. Why is it that some biologics or biosimilars can be injected and others can only be given by IV?
Yeah, that's a complicated pharmacokinetic bioavailability answer. You know, that it depends on how well the molecule can be absorbed from under the skin. So in order for, the drug has to get in the blood in order for it to work. So some molecules are so complex, so large, or for whatever reason, they actually can't get absorbed from the skin into the blood. And therefore, in order for it to be effective, they have to be given by intravenous. But I want to say that actually there were a number of biologics that originally were only available as an intravenous infusion. And then once after, coming on market, then the drug company worked on changing the formulation of it to make it available as an injection. So there's examples of that with abatacept, which originally was only IV and now is available IV and by injection. Infliximab is probably the biologic that we most, is one of the ones that is the only anti-TNF that we would used to only use as an intravenous, but again, just recently, there's a preparation of it that is available as an injectable. And then there's rituximab, and that one is only available as an infusion. And it just really depends on the molecule and whether it can be absorbed effectively or not. But it does change sometimes over time. And you know what, there are other ones I just like. Actemra initially, tocilizumab originally was IV and then got changed to sub-Q. So, if you're on an IV and you don't like it, over time an injection might become available, but sometimes it's just not possible.
Thank
and
you.
Actually, some patients, it is, talking about those patient discussion, some people don't like injections and prefer an intravenous. So that is part of the discussion between the patient and the rheumatologist when choosing a biologic agent. It is one of the things that is part of the discussion that we have. What is patient preference, whether they prefer an injection or an infusion?
Thank you. I know that there's many more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. And I really want to thank Dr. Lacaille and Nikki for kindly sharing their knowledge and experience and expertise with us today. But I also want to thank the audience for joining us. And don't forget to stay on after we've signed off, that we will be showing the video from this that has to do about biosimilars from this series. So we would encourage you to watch that or to see it on our website. I'd like to thank Arthritis Research Education Series sponsors for their support: AbbVie, Biocon Biologics, Fresenius Kabi Canada, and Janssen. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to visit the website, please check out Arthritis Research Education Series at arthritisresearch.ca/learn. We've lots of other episodes on a variety of topics with great videos and frequently asked questions and more. We'll also be sending you a quick survey and hope that you'll take a few minutes to complete it. Your feedback helps us plan for future sessions. So please don't be concerned about sharing with us what you found helpful and how we could improve. And everyone who completes our survey by October 13th will be entered into a draw to win a $25 Starbucks card. So thank you very much. We're now closed with showing you the video from this episode. Thank you.
I definitely have lived in a pretty miserable state without being on medications. My name is Nikki, and I've been living with rheumatoid arthritis for 13 years. I couldn't physically move. I couldn't come down the stairs. My mornings, I would have to plan ahead. I would have to set my alarm clock even 40 minutes before I knew I had to get up because I had to prepare in advance. So my rheumatologist had recommended taking a biologic as her patients had quite a bit of success with it. I was pretty reluctant at first. I didn't know how my body would handle it. I definitely tried to do alternative routes versus taking medication, such as eating healthier and maintaining a healthier lifestyle. But my body recognized that it did need the extra support, and that's when I did begin taking biologics.
Biologic are a new class of medications that have been on the market now for about 20 years for diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. And what is particular about them is they target specific parts of the immune system that are involved in causing the inflammation in rheumatoid arthritis. So they are very effective in their ability to just stop the disease. A biosimilar medication is a biologic that comes out on the market once the patent for the original medication runs out. And at that time, other companies can produce medications that are similar to the original medication for the patent. And we call them biosimilar because they are a very close copy to the original medication that came out on the market. There's two different kinds of policies with the biosimilar. So there's that when we start a new medication, if there's a less expensive version, we have to use that one. But more recently, there are biosimilar transition policies that have been implemented in a number of provinces, whereby when patients are on a medication and a biosimilar becomes available, they need to transition to the less expensive alternative in order for the medication to continue to be covered. Here at Arthritis Research Canada, we've used the data in British Columbia to compare when people are using these new biosimilar medications compared to the prior originator molecule. And what we found is that if people are using a biosimilar to compare to an originator, they stay on the treatment for the same amount of time. And similarly, when people have had to transition from an originator to a biosimilar, they remain on treatment just as long as if people had used an originator all along. So our research findings, I think, are really reassuring for patients that these medications seem to be the same as the original biologic agents.
Main worries for switching from biologic to biosimilar would be, it's just the uncertainty of how your body will react to it. My fear would be also the efficacy and just the quality of life that I have on a biologic. I wouldn't be certain if a biosimilar could provide me the same.
In order to be approved by Health Canada, the manufacturers have to prove that the medication is very similar to the original medication and that it works the same way in the cells. So the pharmacokinetics of the medication have to be the same. The molecule has to function the same way. And also studies have to show that it has the same effectiveness and the same safety as the original molecule. The cost of producing these medications is exactly the same. The reason that they are a lower cost on the market is because the companies have not had to invest in all of the research for what we call the RX&D. So the research that goes into the development of a new drug, the investment into the product has been less costly. It can be a concern for patients whenever we're asking any kind of change, especially they finally get to a medication that works for them, their disease is well controlled, and now we're asking them to change. Change is always difficult. We have more and more of these biological medications that are coming on the market, and this is really, really exciting. Many different classes of biologic agents that target different pathways within the immune system. You know, as new and more of these medications become available, if we want to be able to fund the new drugs, we have to be able to pay less for the old drugs when less expensive alternatives are available.
I've seen people in my life, they've been impacted by their inflammatory diseases and how biologics have worked, because you can't live your life normally per se when you don't know how your disease is going to progress. And going back to 10 years ago, I didn't know that my disease would have progressed, and I just have to adjust my life accordingly, which is unfortunate, but I do appreciate that research is being done to help me live a better quality life.